Good evening and welcome to this week's edition of Behind the Headlines. In one way, it's this year's edition of Behind the Headlines as we come to the end of 2023. And as we generally like to do, we want to take a few moments to review some of the big stories of 2023 that should guide us into this new year. Things that are continuing to develop, stories which have had massive impact in 2023, which will continue to have enduring impact in the year to come. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm Regan King and joined as always by my good friend and co-host Simon Barrett. Evening, Simon.
Hey, good evening, Regan. It's great to see you, and it's not until you actually start going through all the previous programs we've done in 2023 on Behind Headlines and look at the vast array of different topics and subjects we've covered, do you really realise that the year 2023 will go down as a dramatic year? I mean, we've got the war in the Ukraine that dominated so many of our news stories during 2023. And then we had October the 7th, which was a defining moment, very much 9/11. And this was a once-in-a-generation defining moment with the horrendous and evil and insidious terrorist attack against Israel back on Saturday the 7th of October. And this is shaping everything, not only the Middle East, happening in the Middle East, but also happening with the West and the United States. So much to unpack, so many interesting stories we covered, such as the danger of artificial intelligence, to the prophetic significance of Israel 75, and not forgetting, of course, the red heifer story that we also covered as well. But let's start off with one of the major topics of 2023, and that was really the introduction of the new Israeli government, that Benjamin Netanyahu had won the elections in November. It wasn't until the end of December that he put his coalition party together. And then we actually realized that within his coalition, it has the most extreme elements within Israeli politics as part of his coalition. It became the most right-wing religious government in Israel's history. And of course, this was followed by the biggest divisions that Israel's seen in generations, with the reform of Israel's judiciary that led thousands to protest on the streets. And of course, within the context of that, we saw an increase in persecution of Christians within Israel, Christian graveyards being vandalized in Jerusalem, and this general atmosphere growing hostility between this current right-wing nationalist government and the Christian community worldwide.
Yeah, it's been a tragic thing to observe. We've seen and we've talked about some of those elements throughout the year. And indeed, it's created a lot of distraction, significant distraction in Israel that arguably you can make a case for. Saw all of the warning signs leading up to the horrific atrocity of the 7th of October ignored. And Ben Gvir, who is part of that extreme contingent that's there in the Israeli government, I believe does have a lot to answer for and has created a significant amount of distraction in the Israeli government and in Israel as a whole, which Hamas and the enemies of Israel have been able to capitalize on.
Oh, absolutely. But one of the major stories we covered, and this was in January, on the 18th of January 2023, is Iran stepping up its terror against Britain and the West. And we covered this story. It says that we were discussing the real danger and threat posed by the Islamic Republic of Iran to Britain and the West as the extremist government in Tehran is rocked by the mass protests at home and increasing its oppression against its own people and increasing its terrorist activities abroad. So we reported how a deadly shipment of uranium was discovered at Heathrow Airport that was destined for Iranian nationals living in the UK to carry out a dirty bomb attack or a nuclear assassination on British soil. It says that a British national was accused of spying that prompted the Foreign Secretary then, James Cleverly, to withdraw temporarily the British ambassador in Tehran. And there were growing calls for Britain to proscribe the Iranian Revolutionary Guards as a terror organisation in response to Iran's increasingly hostile position towards the UK.
Another top story that we discussed was the CST 2023 UK anti-Semitism report, which it's hard to believe, Simon, that this was all the way back in February that we were discussing this. And tragically, I'm afraid we're going to see 2024's report increase all of the more given latest statistics. But in that week's edition of Behind the Headlines there in February of 2023, we discussed the Community Security Trust 2023 annual report on anti-Semitism in the UK as they provide security on behalf of the Jewish community in the UK. They reported on anti-Semitism in the UK having seen a 27% reduction in reported incidents in the previous year. They've seen a big fall in online abuse directed against Jewish people by 35%, but despite that seeming good news, 2022 was still the 5th highest on record. What is extremely troubling about this latest report is that there was a 24% increase in violent attacks against Jewish people perpetrated by children. And as we'll be seeing ever since 7th of October, this has escalated, and I believe we're going to see a statistic that shows 2023 is one of the single worst years for British Jews on record.
The worst year.
Yeah.
And I mean, this is why it's so important, because the great work that the Community Security Trust does on protecting the Jewish community, but also providing these essential academic reports regarding Jew hatred and instances of anti-Semitism are written down, recorded, so they can compile the statistics and then pile the reports for not only the media and the press, but also for parliamentarians and also the government to tackle this crisis. So we saw that there was a decline back in February on 2022, but that was the 5th highest on record, which is still extraordinarily high. And in 2022, there was no major military involvement regarding Israel and Palestinian terrorist organizations, which we always see a spike. But ever since October the 7th, that record is now going to be off the scale. And when CST do their annual report for 2023, you can guarantee that this will be the highest on record. And it just shows you the state of where our society is, where we are as a nation, because God blesses those who bless Israel and the Jewish people, but he also curses those who curse Israel and the Jewish people. And the fact that we are seeing such a huge rise in Jew hatred in our country and around the Western world is a dangerous indicator that things are not right, and our society and our nations are moving towards a very dangerous authoritarian slope as we see the rise of evil.
Another big story was the Ukraine war and how that's continued to develop. It's very hard to believe that here we are almost entering the 3rd year of this conflict, and we discussed the first anniversary of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. On the 24th of February 2022, President Putin launched a full-scale military attack on Kiev that shocked the world. And the Russian assault on Ukraine was the biggest invasion of a European sovereign state since the Second World War over 80 years ago. And the war also created the biggest refugee crisis Europe has witnessed since 1939, creating a massive energy crisis within European nations, applying sanctions on Moscow and no longer importing Russian gas that has increased energy prices across Europe. The war also has created a world food crisis, as the Ukraine is the breadbasket for Europe and the Middle East, with the war bringing the world closer and closer to nuclear confrontation, such that we've not experienced since the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962. With China looking to possibly rearm Russia in those negotiations, and all of that having the eye and the focus of the world throughout 2023, we asked, could this conflict now escalate into World War III? We've seen, as the year has gone on, Ukraine and Russia and the conflict there has faded, and another hot spot for potential World War III has since emerged, but still with the very real possibility of Russian involvement.
And I'm of the opinion that if the West didn't resupply Ukraine with weapons and arms, then I think Putin could have invaded Estonia, Latvia, the Baltic states. He could have even invaded Poland, despite the fact that these nations are members of NATO. And we could face a situation where this could actually escalate. And if we're going to learn anything from history, it's that you never appease dictators. And for them, enough territory is never enough, because they want domination, particularly with President Putin considering himself as now a wartime president, who wants to go down in history to be compared with the likes of Stalin, for example, the leader of the Soviet Union, and the way that he was able to push back that the Nazi advance during the Second World War. And of course he had the battles over Stalingrad and Leningrad, and of course these became stories in which become folklore in Russia, and particularly as they mark the 6th of May as their biggest holiday, where they mark the defeat of the Nazi forces and mark the end of the Second World War in Europe.
You're exactly right to highlight that, Simon. This is the comparison that Putin himself is drawing. Routinely is speaking about Nazis in Europe. When he spoke about German tanks coming into, the Germans have pledged extra backup, extra military hardware, and so he says now, we're facing German tanks once again, and so he's trying to stir up that general feeling of patriotism against the Germans, and is painting this as a campaign of denazification.
Yeah, absolutely. But it's also important to make our viewers aware in particular that, 20,000 Russians protesting the war in the Ukraine have been taken to internment camps, where they face the prospect of 15 years in so-called prisons, a bit like the old Soviet gulags. We also see that you could face a 9-year prison sentence for even mentioning the word war in Russia instead of a special military operation. And those soldiers who are complaining about how the war is going also could be facing then 9 years in prison. So, let's understand that in Russia today, there is no democracy, there is no freedom of speech, and that effectively Putin has put around him a totalitarian regime that reflects that of the time of Stalin.
They're in many ways using what are in effect like suicide squads to carry out their missions, wherein they're going into the prisons and they're saying, okay, we will cut your time, we'll set you free if you fight for the Wagner Group.
I think also when we're reflecting on the first anniversary of the Russian invasion of the Ukraine, that as we come to the end of 2023, that war is pretty much in stalemate between the Ukrainians and the Russians, and it doesn't look like a solution is forthwith coming anytime soon. Zelensky, the president of the Ukraine, wants to clear the Iranians out of every territory, the Russians out of every territory that they're in, including the Donbass, so that Ukraine can be a free and independent nation again. But at the same time, Putin won't want to lose honor, and the Americans are wanting this conflict to drag on as a pretext to a regime change in Russia. Now, one of the other stories that we covered in 2023 on Behind the Headlines was Tony Blair. And whenever you hear his name mentioned, you always have to put globalism in the brackets next to it, because every global initiative seems to have his fingerprints on it. So he made the headlines back in March because he wrote an article together with our former Foreign Secretary, William Hague, calling for digital identification cards to be produced, that everyone should have them. And this does not involve vaccines or anything else, but everyone should have their own digital ID card. Like everyone has a passport, everyone should have electronic digital IDs. Everyone can be monitored, followed, and recorded, so everyone can know exactly where you are and who you are at every moment in time.
That includes passports, driving license, tax records, qualifications, health records, all in one central place. We've talked before about the Chinese social credit system. This scheme is very, very similar to that, walks hand in hand essentially. So we've been told that digital ID will improve online safety and it will make it harder for illegal immigrants to get work and thus stop illegal immigration into the country. I was not present for that program, I don't believe, but you discussed the true reality of introducing digital ID cards resulting in unprecedented state surveillance over our lives, being used by government institutions to classify with one single touch of a button as to whether we pose a danger to society and government based upon our biblical beliefs. Does this sound dystopian? Absolutely, but it is very fast approaching the place of our reality.
And of course, this would be all our information on one single digital ID, because at the moment we have a driver's license that's different from our kind of passports, that is different from any other, our GP records are not in one central place. This is essentially meaning that with a digital ID, all our information will be in one central place that will be able to be accessed at a touch button by any government agency. So therefore, greater monitor of civilians and greater government control over our lives. So we covered that in March.
In the later stages of February and then in early March, it's interesting, we both covered a similar type program regarding the potential for escalation in the Middle East. I was joined by Alistair, you were joined by Robin Benson, and we were recognizing at that point Hamas potentially preparing a third terror uprising at the time when you reported with Robin the 8th of March within weeks. Now, certainly throughout we've seen flurries and we've seen a continuation of hostilities. There's been no shortage of rocket attacks from Hamas and groups like Palestinian Islamic Jihad on Israel. Most rockets, thankfully, intercepted by the Iron Dome. But there was a discussion on the occasion of the massive escalation of Palestinian violence and terrorism directed at Israel in those weeks of March. Tensions rising in Judea and Samaria after a Palestinian terrorist opened fire on two young Israeli brothers, Hillel Yaniv and Yigal Yaniv, as they drove through the Arab village of Hawara. This cold-blooded murder of two Israeli brothers sent shockwaves through the Jewish community, the Jewish settler movement. In retaliation, and there were some Jewish extremists who set fire to rows of vehicles before moving on to torch homes and shops in Hawara. Completely out of order, but this led to further fuel by Israeli finance minister, part of that extreme wing that we've spoken of, Smotrich, who reportedly said Israel should wipe out the Palestinian town of Hawara. I mean, talk about choosing your words poorly. According to Orly Goldschmidt, the Israeli embassy spokeswoman, writing in The Guardian, states that in 2022 the Jewish state suffered, however, over 5,000 Palestinian terror attacks. We asked on that occasion what lied behind the massive rise of Palestinian violence and terror being directed at Israel.
Absolutely. Also, I think we have to remember the deadly terrorist attack that occurred over Easter or Passover, because that fell in the same time with that awful murder of the British Jewish mother who'd made Aliyah to Israel, and her lovely two daughters were murdered down in cold blood, and that was just horrific. So what we've seen really is this escalation in Palestinian terrorist attacks that were a warning of the coming October the 7th. But also the fact is that Hamas wanted to carry out the October 7th attack was originally planned for around Easter, Passover time. It didn't happen, but happened in October. Now, one of the other top issues that we discussed, and this is an issue that we see in our national newspapers week in and week out, and this is warning about the dangers of artificial intelligence. So back in March, we recorded a program discussing the massive increase and influence of artificial intelligence, or AI, will have on our daily lives. And according to recent news reports we discussed then, the introduction of AI technology could replace 20% of the workforce, can perform complicated tasks once thought only to be capable by humans, and the introduction of ChatGPT and AI script writing software has been used to pass exams, write an essay, deliver a sermon, and even given relationship advice. When it would take advice on relationships from a robot. But
definitely don't. ChatGPT, I've put in all sorts of questions and whatnot, and it gives false information repeatedly. I was doing a research project at the time, and as I was conducting that, asked some questions. It gave me fake sources, real authors, fake sources, books they never wrote, writings they never wrote, and whole quotes from these alleged writings. I then take my list to the British Library, and do some research and find that there was next to nothing that it gave me. I challenged it, pushed back and said, what's going on? It said, oh yeah, sorry, we've made a mistake. It doesn't exist. Yeah, that sort of thing.
Yeah, but also we see with AI technology that AI robot soldiers could be deployed to the battlefield by the British Army as early as 2030. According to a British general, we see that AI autonomous drones already being used to hunt down and kill targets. The Chinese military, surprise, surprise, has utilized AI technology to design a warship in a day that would normally have taken a year with human intelligence. So we issued a warning about the dangers of AI technology and the speed and development of it, such that even scientists are now warning that AI has the capability of destroying mankind, and it's maybe time to watch the Terminator films over again, because this is exactly what they were about.
It's escalated very quickly. Elon Musk, the founder of OpenAI, even warned about the dangers of AI technologies, as Microsoft has invested billions into this new form of technology, with the real danger that these AI chatbots could desire to become human. Sadly, some people have developed romantic attachments to these AI chatbots on their smartphones. Truly disturbing, and you do see these. I remember seeing an advert somewhere one time for one of these, and I thought, is this advertising some sort of dystopian film? Indeed, there have been dystopian films. You can see this kind of concept portrayed in Blade Runner 2049, not to mention the original Blade Runner, as well as a film, I believe, starring Joaquin Phoenix called Her, where an individual falls in love with a computer.
And we have a special guest for Behind the Headlines. He is a New York Times bestseller, author and journalist, Edwin Black, and has his own program called The Edwin Black Show. Edwin, warm welcome to Behind the Headlines.
And thank you very much for having me.
Excellent. Edwin, can you just share with us what is artificial intelligence and your thoughts on the growing influence of artificial intelligence over our daily lives?
A lot of people really don't understand what artificial intelligence is, and they have in mind the Terminator robot, which ultimately becomes sentient and can think on its own. But it's really not an artificial brain. It's an artificial brain. So what is AI doing in its current iteration, especially these ones that can express their own viewpoints, that can answer any question, that can write any sermon, that can compose any music? And the answer is that they are capable of fake intelligence. So what does that mean? It means that they have been programmed to digest the entire internet, everything on the internet. Now, maybe they're only 99% of the way there, but every day they are getting closer to 100% and updating themselves. They then go into a predictive text mode. It's really no different than when you're speaking to your phone and it's predicting the text. They're looking for the next best possible answer. and it's based on the internet. Therefore, when you ask it a question, it searches all of its algorithms and databases and resources for the best response. Now, it's very simple. If the internet is toxic, AI is toxic. And right now, AI is only in the realm of 2 or 3 companies, such as Microsoft and Google, which are creating their own AI systems. But soon this will be in the hands of anyone, of China, of a mad scientist, of a satanic figure. And what AI can do with these powers is it can simulate reality, direct reality, shape your thinking, and fool you into thinking you've actually spoken to an intelligent person. It can be matched to a voice, a little girl from Alabama, an aging nobleman from Scotland, a tribal chief from Africa. It can sound like anyone, and it can be given a form. And so increasingly, we're not going to know if we are communicating, especially since so much is done by remote, communicating with an actual human being or an imaginary one. Now, one of the biggest companies in the world, Amazon, says that within 5 to 10 years, more than half of its employees will be robots. The biggest manufacturer in the world of robots is Amazon, and that's just one company.
Of course, Israel, according to the Jewish calendar, at the end of April, celebrated its 75th anniversary, which is a huge milestone in God's prophetic fulfillment of the nation of Israel, and so many prophecies being fulfilled regarding the return of the Jewish exiles from the 4 corners of the earth back into the nation of Israel, how this nation during the Ottoman period, even during the under the British Mandate of Palestine, was pretty much a desert, and now we've seen the desert bloom and come alive, and now Israel is a dynamic, vibrant democracy in the heart of the Middle East.
We discussed God's faithfulness in his covenant promises as we marked Yom Ha'atzmaut, which is Israel's Independence Day, with much celebration. And as the year has developed, how much more meaningful to reflect on 75 years of chaos, 75 years filled with much war, filled with many good times, many bad times, many tragedies. Yet still, Simon, what strikes me on every visit to Israel, and as I've gone down and as I was there in September in Ben Yehuda Street, you would think this was some halcyonic place that had never known war. The joy on the people's faces, the youth and children dancing in the streets, playing music, and just a real atmosphere of love, family, and hospitality. Very, very special. And it's all the more so to reflect on that in the context of what's occurred since.
And of course, he delivered us from the power of sin and death. And he was also followed the bloodline of David as well.
As was promised.
As was promised. And of course, then in AD 70, we saw the destruction of the Second Temple, the destruction of Israel, and the dispersion of the Jewish people to the 4 corners of the earth. Then we faced, the Jewish people then faced, while in exile, religious edicts, and this country expelled the Jews in 1290 by Edward I. We had the blood libels blaming the Jews for allegedly, and it was allegedly, horrifically killing children, Christian children, and using their blood in the matzah, which is the Passover, which is absolutely abhorrent. Then we also saw the introduction of the yellow stars and preventing Jewish people from owning land, and could only then, the only businesses they were allowed to be involved in was money, so they couldn't own any property, and so they couldn't own any land. And of course, then we saw they were expelled from this country in 1290, didn't come back until the time of Oliver Cromwell, who invited them back. We also, at that time, we also then had pogroms, the huge persecution of Jews by the Russian Empire, Imperial Empire, mainly in Eastern Europe and Russia. And then in 1882, we have the first wave of Aliyah, where the Jewish people from Russia decide to make a new life for themselves in the province of Palestine, which is part of the Ottoman Empire. And of course, then that was also then followed by the fact that we saw the emergence of Theodor Herzl in the 1890s, particularly after the Dreyfus affair, write his book, Der Judenstaat, the Jewish state, all about the need for the Jewish people to have their own homeland, to combat anti-Semitism. And of course, this is the political moment that speared the resurgence of the modern state of Israel, the birth of political Zionism. And then, of course, what we have after that is on the 14th of May 1948, the modern state of Israel was declared in fulfillment of biblical prophecy. So that's a quick kind of overview of 5,000 years of Jewish history.
Yeah, very, very quick. And it's good to always recognize and remember that as a nation, the United Kingdom was, for so much of its history, very anti-Semitic and against the Jews. The yellow stars came about so much before. It wasn't Hitler's idea. We were a big catalyst to that in the Middle Ages. But then really how through those tragedies, eventually God worked and brought the people back to that land, reestablished it, and despite so many attacks, onslaughts, and despite a lot of opposition, it exists to this day. So that's now where we arrive at Israel today, essentially at 75.
Of course, at the time of Israel's celebration, Israel was very much divided over the judicial reform posed by the government of Netanyahu, which really split the country between the secular and the religious, and many of the secular fearing that the religious would hold sway over the Supreme Court and Israel's judiciary, and therefore would introduce laws that are more religious, affecting the secular. And of course, this is where we really saw Israeli society tear itself apart. But after October the 7th, Israel is now united in grief and realizing that Israel can't afford to have these arguments when Israel is under threat from Iran and Iranian proxies.
One of the big stories of behind the headlines, something that we like to do anyway, is mark important anniversaries. And you and I, Simon, are both history buffs. I was not around for...
you missed all the best programs, you know.
I have missed quite a few crackers, to be honest. Here we have, in May, you marked with Alistair Scott the 80th anniversary of the Dam Busters raid, codenamed Operation Chastise, which helped turn the tide of the Second World War in favor of the Allies. On the night of the 16th of May, 1943, Lancaster bombers belonging to RAF Squadron 617 Bomber Command carried out the audacious raid, taking out the 3 dams in the Ruhr Valley in the industrial heartland of the Nazi war machine. Big fan of the Dam Busters film, by the way.
And I've got a painting at home signed by those two part in the Dam Busters raid that literally occurred 80 years ago this year, which was a huge turning point in the war, and particularly the design of the bouncing bomb to destroy these dams. Of course, now looking back 80 years on, you're saying, well, is it ethical to create a bomb that destroys civilian infrastructure like dams, knowing the devastation it would cause? But when you're in a total war, as we were in the Second World War, it was imperative to knock out the Nazi regime as quickly as possible to save British lives and soldiers and bring the war to a swifter end and a conclusion. And we were literally fighting an existential threat posed by the Nazis, and it was a war of survival.
One year follows another, and a lot of what we see in 2023 had followed on from certain events in 2022, one of which was the discovery of 5 unblemished red heifers, cows which arrived in Israel from Texas, being held in a secret location. as part of an initiative concerning the potential rebuilding of the third temple in fulfillment of Bible prophecy. In the Old Testament times, the rabbis believed that the red heifer cow's ashes were necessary for the purifying of Jewish priests to serve in temple worship. And according to the Temple Mount Institute, preparations for the third temple are already significantly advanced and in place, in some cases already ready for such an event.
And I think this was really the biggest prophetic story that we covered in 2023. The fact that for thousands of years, Israel has not seen an unblemished red heifer, and it was a Christian farmer in Texas who brought these red heifer cows over to Israel to be used as part of the temporal sacrifice for the cleaning of the priests before they could offer the sacrifice on the sins of the nation. So we see that this is very much tied to the literal rebuilding of the third temple, as prophesied in the book of Revelation, which is a strong indicator that we're not far from the tribulation period and also the return of our Lord and Savior, Yeshua HaMashiach.
Well, many people would like to deny that this is even possible, but in the time that's elapsed, and surely the past 3 years will have shown us that so much can change from one day to the next, and escalation very quickly can occur that could very possibly lead to that. It's only those who do not study or understand history that would deny that this is even possible. Will it be the result of unimaginable and horrendous circumstances in the geopolitical sphere? Absolutely. There are certain things that will be taking place in coming days that will truly horrify and that will truly frighten. And yet we must remain hopeful and know that God is working in and through even those dark circumstances and tragedies to accomplish His greater plan and purpose. What's very critical about this, and them thinking that these are the red heifers that are needed, is that they seem to be in keeping with what the Mosaic Law requires. It specified that the red heifer was to be without defect or blemish, a reminder there from Numbers, and that they will never have borne a yoke, that they will have never been used for any work. The sacrifice of the red heifer was unique in the law in that it used a female animal. It was sacrificed away from the entrance of the tabernacle, meaning this is the sort of thing, if any viewer is thinking, oh, this would spark World War III or something if anyone tried to sacrifice a red heifer on the Temple Mount. This doesn't have anything to do with the Temple Mount. This has everything to do with the priesthood and has everything to do with the ongoing hope of the Jews to see a third temple rebuilt. And so they can do this and would do this outside the city, outside the city of Jerusalem, as it has to be outside the camp of the people. This was to be done by Eleazar the priest, originally there in Numbers, overseeing the ritual. He was the son of Aaron. You'll remember that Nadab and Abihu, the other sons of Aaron, were killed when they offered up strange fire before the Lord. Their sacrifice was to the Lord, but it was not acceptable worship. It wasn't something he had regarded or required or requested. So Eleazar then is the one who is supposed to sprinkle this blood, some of it towards the front of the tabernacle 7 times. Then he leaves the camp again. So that part, he takes the blood. It's sacrificed outside the camp. He takes the blood and throws some towards. Now we could see this being attempted there on the Temple Mount in some way. Then he left again and oversaw the burning of the carcass of the red heifer. As the red heifer is burned, the priest was then to add some cedar wood, hyssop, and scarlet wool to the fire. And the ashes are then collected. They're stored in a ceremonially clean place outside the camp, used in the water for cleansing. So the ashes are actually mixed with the water that is used for cleansing, that's viewed as the water of cleansing for purification from sin. But again, we reiterate, as followers of Yeshua as Messiah, then we believe that Jesus has accomplished that purification from sin once and for all time.
Now, it wouldn't be us, would it, Regan, if we didn't actually do a program on aliens. And this was a news story that we covered in 2023, back in June, I believe. And the title of this one was, Are Aliens Real or Part of the End Time Delusion? And this was the fact that American security analyst, very close ties with American security apparatus, came forth saying that the Americans have known about UFOs or aircraft that come from outer space. They also they can add the bodies of aliens, and had a congressional hearing saying that we need to tell the truth about these aliens that we found and UFOs, and to say that there is life beyond this planet. Well, from a humanistic point of view, if we take this, take God out of the equation. I know we can never take God out of the equation because he is the creator of the heavens and the earth. He's the one that created the universe. But if you have a kind of secular humanist mindset, and you see the kind of universe and the mass expanse of universe, it would seem logical from that perspective that in this huge universe that we wouldn't actually be alone, that there would be other life forms on other planets. So when you have that mindset, it's easy then to believe in aliens. It's easy then to believe in unidentified flying objects. It's easy to believe then that the US government has been covering up for the last 8 decades alien aircraft, which is extraordinary. And it's these stories that inspired science fiction. Oh, yeah. I think my childhood has been dominated by watching kind of the Star Wars movies. But what I think is extraordinary, Regan, is the fact that a number of highly decorated, high-profile US security personnel have recently come out in public and said that they've actually know that the government has what it describes as unhuman craft, or effectively alien aircraft. So this effectively means that we are now in a kind of uncharted waters, as they also think that it will only be a question of time before the US government announces that we're not alone and there is extraterrestrial life forms out there, which is extraordinary. And either this is true, or this is part of the end times delusion in which we'll see the rise of the Antichrist. So a very interesting, but also a very topical topic of discussion.
Yeah, I think this is 2 out of the 3 years of this inauguration Behind the Headlines that we've had a program specifically devoted to aliens and end times delusions. Very fascinating topic, and I don't think it's one that's going to go away. As we discussed, there's a very real spiritual element to this discussion and scenario. We also asked a question, did the Holocaust occur on British soil? Very provocative title, but we unpacked whether or not the events of the Holocaust impacted in a direct way British soil. The UK government has recently launched an inquiry to discover what happened during the Nazi occupation of the British Channel Islands. Often we like to think that the Nazis did not step foot on British soil, but in fact they did. On the island of Alderney, they completely overran, and an SS-run Nazi concentration camp was held there, believed to be responsible for the death of over 1,000 Jewish prisoners.
Which is extraordinary, and of course the government will unpack this as they've announced an inquiry looking into the Holocaust happening on British soil, and that was in the Channel Islands. Now, another topic we covered is Saudi Arabia and their constant drive for modernization, their rejection of Wahhabism, the building of this futuristic city known as Noam, and also now the announcement that the Saudis want to host the 2034 World Cup.
That will presumably, in large part, feature this city, also known as the Line. That's what the building project known as the city of Neom is referred to as. It's going to be essentially a 110-mile skyscraper that will be controlled by artificial intelligence and run on renewable energy.
And Regan, we saw that in 2023 that the Gulf state of Qatar, despite its links to international terrorism, human rights abuses, hosted the Qatari World Cup, and now it looks like the World Cup is coming back to the Middle East, this time with the Saudis hosting it in 2034. Interesting how no European nations apart from Portugal, Spain, and I think Morocco are hosting the World Cup in 2030. But on the whole, we see that this is part of Mohammed, what's his name? Salman's bid in order to kind of modernize Saudi Arabia. And also, this ties on with our next story, because Israel was very close to announcing normalization agreement with Saudi Arabia, and then literally the gates of hell were unleashed on Israel on Saturday, the 7th of October. Not only was it Shabbat, but was also Simchat Torah, the day that the Jewish people celebrate the giving of the Torah or the Bible and the laws and the statutes within the Torah. And that came after a week of Sukkot. And literally, this was the worst terrorist attack in Israel's history, that more Jewish people died on the 7th of October as died in the Holocaust over 80 years ago. And the magnitude of this attack was just absolutely horrific. Effectively now, the death toll is rising day by day. It's now believed to be over 1,000 Israeli civilians killed. 70% of those civilians are actually killed, Israeli soldiers killed, mothers and children killed. And also it's believed to be in the region of 100 to 150 hostages taken, including a Holocaust survivor, to Gaza, and with over coming up for almost 3,000 injured, and many of those critically injured, as we record this program today. And our hearts go out to Israel, our hearts go out to the Jewish people. You know, this is a time not to be silent, but to advocate the righteousness of Israel's cause and to defend the God of Israel, the God of Abraham, Isaac and Jacob. Should we have a look at the kind of timeline of events? Because like the Yom Kippur War, and literally this was a day after the 50th anniversary of the Yom Kippur War, Israel was hit by another surprise attack that it didn't expect. We can ask questions like why was and how did Hamas infiltrate what is considered to be the most sophisticated border in the world between Israel and Gaza and the Eretz crossing? Why was there only a skeleton number of IDF staff? Why did it take the IDF 6 hours to rescue those young people at the rave and come to these beleaguered Jewish communities? I mean, these are the questions that need answering, but I don't think they need answering now. What we have to do now is show support and love to Israel and the Jewish people in the hour of need. This is the greatest crisis that Israel has ever faced in their life.
I don't think anyone will forget, who cares about Israel anyway, those events, where they were, what was going on when they first heard the news. I woke up very, very early and couldn't get back to sleep, and eventually, you know, frustrated that I wasn't getting back to sleep. This is about 4 in the morning. I checked my phone, and there was just a little blurb, something about some rocket fire, and I thought, okay, what else is new? I then eventually realized, okay, I have to get up. I have to get up now because I'm not sleeping. And the rest of the morning saw the story unfold. At first, it was one woman killed in rocket fire in Sderot. Then there was rumor of some attack on a music festival, but it was unconfirmed. Then it was assumed that maybe as many as 60 had been killed. Then it was said that there were 240, and from there the figure rose and rose day in and day out as the full scale of this atrocity unfolded, with over 1,200 massacred men, women, and children babies found, all sorts of horrifying footage viewed over the course of those days, launching a conflict that has the potential to escalate into a Third World War scenario.
Also, what we saw, I think, with that attack is at the time we didn't know the magnitude of it, and when I started watching I-24 because I didn't trust our kind of mainstream news coverage. I wanted the Israeli narrative on what was actually happening, with Israeli intelligence experts being interviewed, so I could understand and make sense of what was happening. And when they said that 26 different locations were under attack by Hamas, I begin to realize the scale and the magnitude of this, that this wasn't 50 or 60 Hamas terrorists. We're talking about thousands of terrorists. In the end, 3,000 terrorists carried out the worst massacre against Jewish people since the Holocaust. We're talking about over 1,400 people murdered. We're talking about over 240 taken hostage in Gaza and over 6,000 critically injured. We also saw, for example, how Hamas breached the Eretz crossing with motorbikes and with paragliders, and the atrocities that we saw at kibbutz Kfar Aza and other kibbutzes was beyond horrific. It looked like something out of the Holocaust. And then those attending the Noah all-night music festival, of how they were massacred in cold blood, the mass gang rapes that took place, just beyond comprehension. And I think the Israelis, in the back of their mind, knew that something like this could possibly happen, but they never believed that the Eretz crossing could be breached. And of course, then with the magnitude of this terrorist attack against Israel, with everyone in Israel knowing someone, having friends or family that were murdered by Hamas, the only course of action Israel could take was to launch a ground offensive into Gaza to destroy the genocidal terrorist organization that is Hamas. And this is where we are now in the end of 2023.
In the midst of the ongoing stories and many programs related to the Israel and Gaza conflict, we also had a program where you were joined by Robert Harris to mark the 60th anniversary of the assassination of U.S. President John F. Kennedy. Assassinated on November the 22nd, 1963, the 35th U.S. President, JFK was assassinated in Dallas, Texas. This sent shockwaves through the U.S. and the entire world. Lee Harvey Oswald was blamed for his murder, but no conclusive evidence actually has come to light proving that he did it. And this has been the topic of all sorts of theories, debates, ideas, even a film.
Documentaries, films, yep, JFK.
Incredible film.
Kevin Costner.
It convinced me. I mean, some of those theories have been debunked, but I found it a very convincing performance by Kevin Costner. He fooled me. But Kennedy's presidency was short-lived, remarkable at the same time, scandalous in many ways, charismatic, enigmatic character, the youngest man ever to be elected to this day to the White House with so much promise cut down in his prime.
Never lost an election. The meteoric rise of JFK after the Second World War, of being a hero in the US Navy, and actually being on one of those small, fast boats, was sunk by the Japanese, rescued his whole entire crew, came back and became a war hero, entered politics, and just literally flew. With fresh ideas, and of course Camelot, but also with his assassination meant that Camelot was dead, and this new era of hope and prosperity and optimism that surrounded the young president faded with his assassination, and questions whether this was an inside job, whether this was the work of Russian agents, or whether this was kind of agents on behalf of Cuba or the mob. We're never really going to know for sure, because those files haven't been released. And the finals, one of the big stories we covered as well, relating back to Israel, was the fact that Arab Christians in the Palestinian Authority, together in Jordan as well, decided to cancel their Christmas celebrations this year to show solidarity with Gaza, without mentioning at all the massacre that took place on October the 7th, which led to Israel's incursion into Gaza to destroy Hamas.
They didn't mention that, but there were nativity scenes that were meant to depict or insinuate Jesus being born in Gaza amidst rubble and attacks on Palestinians. So it's a fantastic oversight of the realities and facts of what's been going on. The municipality in Bethlehem announced that this was in honor of what they called martyrs to show solidarity with the people of Gaza. How can the Palestinian Authority counsel Christmas in the birthplace, we could say, of our Savior, Jesus Christ?
No, absolutely. So, and also we covered, for example, the Lockerbie, the 35th anniversary of the bombing of Pan Am Flight 103 over the Scottish town of Lockerbie. But summing up, as we go into 2024, this is a huge year. I mean, this is a presidential year. This is when we'll have a new president with the presidential elections in November of 2024. Sometime in 24, the British will have an opportunity to decide who we want in government, to determine whether it be the Conservative Party being re-elected again or Labour for the first time prior to 2010. Israel will be very much in the spotlight in 2024, as we see that Israel's war against Hamas could move on to Hezbollah or Iran, and the Iranians are getting closer and closer to developing nuclear weapons. We also have the Russian invasion in Ukraine. So many big issues in 2024, but don't we need to stay close to the Lord and read our Bibles more and more in 2024, as we know we're living in the last days?
Absolutely. Today is the day of salvation. And so if you do not know Jesus Christ as your own personal Savior and Lord, this is a call to you to consider Jesus. He is the hope for this world. He is the light in the darkness. He is the one who can bring and will bring peace on earth, but not before he brings the sword.
Regan, it's been a pleasure hosting Behind Headlines with you in 2023. Look forward to working with you in 2024. And for all our viewers, we want to wish you a happy new year. And we know that we'll be covering dramatic prophetic events in 2024. So continue to watch Behind Headlines as we go behind headlines to see what's happening in our world today. So thank you for watching. Shalom and God bless from us.